I'm Dane, and this is Dane Explains. A few weeks ago, I did a video on methods that could be used to terraform small worlds like the Moon and Mercury. Today is part 2. Sort of. Today, let's talk about how engineering organisms may be able to create a stable biosphere on practically any world. Let me explain why. At the end of my previous video, I mentioned one of the methods to help small worlds retain atmosphere is to essentially cap it using extremely tiny hydrogen or helium balloons that are lower density than the air itself, creating a layer in the upper atmosphere that helps prevent gases from escaping. This works because the average velocity of the tiny balloons would be far, far lower than the escape velocity of the world, even though their density is lower than that of the molecules in the atmosphere they're mixed with. To create an organism that could do the same thing as the balloons, you would have to resort to using hydrogen instead of helium, because the helium is inert to life and it's extremely hard to keep in a container. The organisms would have to have 3 phases of life: the water phase, the ascent phase, and the descent phase. And you need to do as much as you could to prevent the organisms from dying in the upper atmosphere. If you're unable to prevent this, then you would just be creating a method to shuttle water from the surface right out into space. And a process similar to how Mars and Venus lost their oceans, only much faster. Ideally, the organism would be a single-celled organism that starts its life cycle in the water on the ground. It would accumulate water inside in large amounts, similar to how fat cells accumulate fat. It would also create large amounts of polyunsaturated fats mixed with water, or in vesicles, using photosynthesis. I'll get to why the cells need to make unsaturated fats in a minute. Then we'll start splitting the water molecules in a process close to photosynthesis. But instead of incorporating the hydrogen with the carbon to make sugars, it would store the hydrogen in a vacuole as a gas, which is basically an air bubble in a cell. It would release the oxygen from the water molecule into the atmosphere, similar to photosynthesis. In fact, this probably would just be a modified form of photosynthesis. Eventually, the organisms would float at the surface of the water, and then float into the air once they had stored enough hydrogen in their vacuole to become less dense than the air, beginning its ascent phase of life. Once in the air, it would continue to process its excess of water into hydrogen. Hydrogen is pretty squirrely, so keeping it stored in a vacuole would most likely have to be an active process. The more water it processed into hydrogen, the higher it would get in the atmosphere, until virtually the only thing around it was other organisms and no free gas molecules. At this point, there's a critical step. The organism would need an enzyme that's activated by UV light to start consuming the hydrogen, hydrogenating the polyunsaturated fats it stored earlier. This has an added benefit to the terraformed world, negating the need for an ozone layer, since these organisms would be absorbing the sun's UV light high up in the atmosphere. The consumption of the hydrogen causes the organism to descend. This starts the beginning of the descent phase of the organism's life. Once it gets low enough in the atmosphere to start encountering oxygen molecules, it would run out of polyunsaturated fats to hydrogenate. The saturated fats would then act as an enzymatic catalyst, and the organism would start scavenging oxygen and burning it with the hydrogen left in its vacuole, creating water and weighing it down even more. If it didn't use the saturated fat as a catalyst, the organism would just consume all its hydrogen in the ascent phase, getting it nowhere. Eventually, it would settle on the ground, where it would lie dormant until it was washed into a body of water by rain, if it didn't land in one in the first place. The organism would then divide into 2 cells, completing its life cycle. This engineered organism would work much better than using tiny hydrogen balloons to hold down the atmosphere, because the process is active. They actively reproduce, so they wouldn't need to be replenished when they get damaged. And they also actively scavenge molecular oxygen from the upper atmosphere during the descent phase of their life, reducing the likelihood that any of the oxygen could escape into space before being absorbed. They would probably also need to aggressively scavenge molecular hydrogen at all stages of their life. to reduce the risk of the hydrogen escaping into space if one of the organisms died high up in the atmosphere, which would probably happen all the time. This all probably sounds impossible, but nearly all the molecular mechanics that are needed to make this work exist in one organism or another on Earth. So they'd only need to be combined in the correct way. A note here is, there probably would not be much nitrogen in the atmosphere. Unlike oxygen, it doesn't like to react with much, and requires much more energy to process, although a photosynthetic process requiring 5 to 10 UV photons could be devised. Also, this is a very simplified explanation, since I try to keep my videos as short as possible. I could probably make an hour-long video on this if I had the time. Engineered organisms similar to this one I just described could also be helped to sustain other worlds with different sorts of issues, like the intense heat of Mercury. But that's a story for another video. So, stay tuned, and thank you for watching. If you like this video, and other topics ranging from theology to science, please press the like button, subscribe to my channel, and ding the bell to get notified when I post new videos. Also, please support me on Patreon to get extra content and special perks. Link in the description. The more people support me, the more time I can dedicate to making videos like this one. So, until next time, have a great week.